Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we tackle big ideas and find those surprising connections.
Great to be here.
Today, we're diving into a really fascinating realm. Knowledge that
Yeah.
flows, beyond the textbooks, beyond the traditional ways we're often taught to understand things.
Mm,
Imagine it as an unseen current, maybe.
yeah.
A powerful, sometimes hidden force that has woven its way right through human history.
That's a great way to put it. And this isn't just about, like, ancient secrets or forgotten lore, is it?
No, not at all.
Our deep dive today is into mystical and esoteric knowledge. And it's this persistent, really influential force in intellectual, spiritual, and cultural history. And it's often challenged the very ideas that existed alongside.
So our mission in this deep dive, basically, is to give you a clear, multidisciplinary look at this pretty complex phenomenon.
Right.
We'll start by defining our terms, trying to get a handle on the language,
Which is crucial here.
then journey through some global traditions, uncover some, well, surprising similarities, explore their profound cultural impact, and finally take a critical look at some of the claims they make.
Yeah, the goal is really to illuminate this fundamental aspect of the human quest for meaning, and maybe, just maybe, challenge some of your conventional understandings of consciousness, reality, and the divine.
And this is all built from a pretty comprehensive report we've got, analyzing these complex phenomena from various sources. So it's kind of a shortcut to getting really well informed on this stuff.
Exactly. It cuts through a lot of the noise.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we really dive deep, we need to get clear on our terms: mysticism and esotericism.
Yeah,
They get used interchangeably, like all the time in everyday conversation.
they really do.
But our sources tell us they're actually quite distinct. And what's really interesting is that these terms themselves, they're kind of modern scholarly creations, aren't they?
That's the key insight, I think. The very act of defining them academically, it shows us how modern thought tried to neatly categorize and often, frankly, sideline these profound spiritual experiences that just didn't fit into, traditional religion or scientific rationalism.
Ah, so it was less about understanding them on their own terms.
Exactly. More about finding a convenient box to put them in.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. Let's start with mysticism, because its history is quite a journey itself.
Mm-hmm.
It originates in the ancient Greek verb mu,
Yeah.
which meant to close, like closing your eyes or mouth in silence. So a mystis was basically an initiate into a secret cult.
Like the Eleusinian mysteries, those famous ones.
Exactly. And the focus there was on secret communal rites, not really personal experience as we might think of it now.
Right. It was about being sworn to secrecy, part of the group.
This concept was then sort of reimagined by early Christianity. The Greek word mystikos started to mean things like hidden biblical interpretations.
Uh-huh. Or the sacred mystery of the Eucharist.
And crucially, a direct, almost experiential knowledge of God.
Yeah, and this idea was, well, heavily influenced by figures like Pseudo-Dionysius.
Yeah.
He talked about a mystical theology that sought God not by what he is, because that's maybe impossible to grasp,
Right.
but by what he isn't. It's called apophatic or negative theology. A fascinating approach to describing the, well, indescribable.
So as Christianity spread, how did this idea of mystery or the hidden keep evolving, especially moving into the Middle Ages? Did it start shifting more towards that personal spiritual experience then?
It absolutely did, big time. The 13th century saw the emergence of the phrase unio mystica.
Mystical union.
Exactly, mystical union. It was coined as a synonym for the spiritual marriage that mystics like St. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote about experiencing.
Wow.
And then you had really radical thinkers like Meister Eckhart, who talked about God's presence being so utterly immanent, like right within the human soul itself.
Okay, then came a really profound shift around the 17th century, you said.
Yes, a kind of sea change.
The term mysticism itself transformed. It stopped being just about hidden religious rites and became this standalone concept,
A substantive noun.
and increasingly defined as a private, subjective, intensely personal experience, almost separated from the bigger religious system, scripture, liturgy.
Deracinated, yeah. Pulled out of its total religious matrix. And this really, really took off with William James in the early 20th century.
Yes.
His groundbreaking work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, it truly popularized this idea of religious experience as a distinct psychological phenomenon, something you could study.
So William James really gave us a modern framework for thinking about this. He described mystical experiences as having, 4 key qualities.
That's right.
First, they're often indescribable, ineffable. You just can't put them into words properly.
Mhm.
Second, they feel like a profound flash of insight, a true knowing, the noetic quality.
Like you've learned something fundamental.
Exactly. Third, they're usually brief, transient, but leave a lasting impact.
Fleeting but powerful.
And finally, there's that sense of passivity, of being completely overwhelmed or grasped by something greater than yourself.
Yeah. And his work really cemented this modern interpretation of mysticism as maybe a universal cross-cultural experience of union with some kind of absolute.
It did, but you also mentioned it led to some confusion.
Well, yeah, it also contributed to its contemporary ambiguity. Today, the term is notoriously broad, kind of imprecise. It often gets used for just about anything nebulous, esoteric, occult, or supernatural.
Which makes clear scholarly analysis pretty challenging, I imagine.
Definitely.
Okay, that gives us a really rich history for mysticism. But you mentioned earlier that esotericism is actually a much more recent concept, even though the idea of hidden knowledge is ancient. Can you unpack that distinction?
You're absolutely right. The concept of restricted inner knowledge is ancient. It traces back to the Greek esoterikos, meaning belonging to an inner circle based on esu, within. But the noun esotericism itself, it didn't actually appear until 1828. Jacques Matter used it. So while the idea of inner teachings existed for millennia, the academic category we use is quite modern.
So it really emerges after the Enlightenment, almost as a way for alternative spiritual groups to define themselves against, well, both dominant Christianity and the rise of scientific rationalism.
Precisely. It almost becomes a retrospective label for traditions that were, in a way, rejected or pushed to the margins by those dominant forces.
That makes sense.
And modern academic definitions kind of reflect this history. Some scholars see it as pointing to a perennial inner tradition, like a universal hidden wisdom running through history.
Okay.
Others, like Antoine Favre, define it more as a particular form of thought or an enchanted worldview, one that emphasizes correspondences, living nature, imagination, transformation, basically a countercurrent to the modern disenchantment of the world.
And didn't Rudolf Hanegraaff call it something like rejected knowledge?
He did, influentially, almost like an academic wastebasket for knowledge and practices rejected by mainstream religion and science, which is a provocative idea.
Definitely.
And then Arthur Versluis emphasizes a key defining feature, a claim to gnosis, that direct, unmediated spiritual insight we talked about.
Okay, that clears things up a lot. So where do mysticism and esotericism intersect, and where do they diverge? Because they're clearly related, but you're saying they're distinct.
Well, historically and just colloquially, they often blur together, right? Mysticism frequently gets stretched to cover things like magic or occultism, too.
Yeah, you hear that.
And this conflation is partly a product of modern intellectual thought, where both mysticism and magic were kind of relegated to the non-rational realm, put in opposition to science and institutional religion.
But academically, scholars try to make a clearer differentiation. You mentioned Versluis positioning esotericism as the broader category.
Yes, focusing on that inner or spiritual knowledge held by a limited group. And then within that broad field of esotericism, you can maybe see two poles.
Okay, what are they?
Mysticism is often seen as the metaphysical pole. Its primary concern is that inner knowledge of human nature and its relationship with the divine, the absolute. It often involves a via negativa, an inward journey of contemplation, maybe self-denial, to attain union.
And the other pole?
Magic is often seen as the cosmological pole. It seeks secret knowledge of the universe, often to manipulate forces, maybe through external rituals, symbols more of a via positiva.
But you stress it's not a hard and fast rule, right? There
Right.
must be overlap.
Oh, absolutely key. The distinction isn't absolute at all. They're deeply connected, often by that microcosm, macrocosm principle, the idea that the human reflects the universe.
So you get things like,
Well, you find terms like Kabbalistic mysticism, which clearly blends cosmological maps, like the Tree of Life, with very deep inner journeys. Or something like Theosophy, which combines grand cosmological speculation with specific spiritual paths for the individual. They often blend and inform each other in this shared quest for hidden knowledge.
right. Okay, now, with those definitions hopefully a bit clearer, let's explore the traditions themselves. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah, the historical journey.
This is where we really begin to see the incredible diversity, the richness of humanity's search for these hidden truths. As we trace this unseen current through all these different global traditions, you'll really see how far-reaching these ideas have been.
And the Western esoteric traditions, for instance, they form this incredibly complex tapestry, really rooted in ancient Hellenistic thought.
Hmm.
They were often marginalized, pushed to the edges, yet they profoundly influenced Western art, literature, even science and philosophy in surprising ways.
And they often share common concepts, you mentioned.
Yeah, frequently concepts like gnosis, that direct personal knowledge we keep coming back to, the microcosm, macrocosm analogy, as above, so below, and the idea of a prisca theologia, an ancient universal wisdom that supposedly underlies all religions.
Okay, so let's start with Hermeticism. That emerged in Hellenistic Egypt, right? Around the 2nd to 3rd centuries CE, attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus.
That's the one. Its core idea, fundamentally, is that the universe is a divine manifestation. And there's this ancient original wisdom, the prisca theologia,
And it gave us that famous phrase.
as above, so below,
Yeah.
from the Emerald Tablet. It means the patterns you see out there in the cosmos are reflected right here within us.
And the goal.
The goal is a profound insight, a gnosis specifically through understanding the divine mind, or nous, which leads to spiritual rebirth and ultimately union with the divine all.
Okay. And then there's Gnosticism, also from that Greco-Roman world, around the 2nd century CE. Its name literally comes from gnosis.
Right, Gnosticism had a very stark view of things, a radical dualism.
Oh, so.
It believed there's this pure, transcendent spiritual world, the pleroma, and then there's this flawed material world we live in, which they believed was created by a lesser ignorant deity they called the demiurge.
Wow. Okay.
So the core idea was that you, your true self, have a divine spark from that higher realm, but it's trapped inside your physical body in this lower world.
And liberation comes.
Liberation comes through gnosis, that direct, intuitive insight, which helps you remember your true divine origin and ultimately escape this physical realm, transcend the cosmos and its rulers, the archons, and return to the pleroma.
Fascinating. Then there's alchemy, practiced all over Greco-Roman Egypt, the Islamic world, India, China. We often just think of it as trying to turn lead into gold.
Yeah, the stereotype.
But it was so much more than that, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. That physical transmutation, base metals to gold, was seen as inextricably linked to spiritual transmutation, the purification and perfection of the soul. It revolved around concepts like the prima materia, the primordial substance of everything, and the legendary philosopher's stone.
Which wasn't just for making gold.
No. It was seen as the catalyst for both physical and spiritual transmutation, and maybe even an elixir of life. The whole journey was called the Great Work, the magnum opus, a systematic process, often described in stages like blackening, whitening, reddening.
Representing psychological and spiritual transformation.
Exactly, purifying the self.
Moving on to Kabbalah. This is the esoteric tradition within Judaism emerging in medieval Spain and France, 12th, 13th centuries. The name itself means to receive, right?
From the Hebrew, yes. Kabbalah describes the transcendent Godhead, the Ein Sof, which means without end, emanating outwards through 10 divine attributes or potencies. These are called the Sephirot.
And they're arranged in the Tree of Life diagram.
Precisely. The Tree of Life serves as a kind of map of the cosmos, a blueprint for creation, and importantly, a map of the human soul itself.
And the goal for the practitioner.
Well, goals include devakut, a kind of deep ecstatic communion or clinging to God, and also tikkun olam, which is the concept of repairing the world, helping to restore cosmic harmony.
And then there's Rosicrucianism, which appeared quite dramatically in early 17th century Germany. These anonymous manifestos, the symbol of the Rose Cross.
Yeah, it caused quite a stir. The legend spoke of Christian Rosenkreuz, this figure who supposedly acquired secret wisdom in the East and founded a secret order dedicated to the universal reformation of mankind.
And the discovery of his tomb was meant to signal a new era.
Right, the revelation of this hidden knowledge. Its core ideas were really a synthesis drawing on Hermeticism, alchemy, Christian mysticism, Kabbalah, all aimed at individual and societal spiritual transformation. A call for reform in science, philosophy, ethics.
It's just incredible to see all these interconnected threads, this unseen current running through Western history. But what happens when we shift our focus east? Do we find similar kinds of searches for hidden truths there?
We absolutely do. Primarily coming out of the Indian subcontinent, China, the Islamic world, these Eastern paths also strongly emphasize experiential knowledge, meditation, and that ultimate journey toward liberation or union with the divine. Different cultural expressions, but often parallel concerns.
So let's start with Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam. That emerged around the 8th–9th century CE, partly as a reaction against worldliness.
That's right. The name Sufi might even come from Suf, the simple wool garments early ascetics wore. Fundamentally, it's about attaining a deep nearness, qurb, to God through direct experience, dak, and particularly through divine love, ishku.
So it's an inner path.
Very much an inner path of transformation, aiming for the annihilation of the ego self, fana, in God, and then sometimes subsistence, baka, in God. Practice often involves a close master-disciple relationship, the sheikh or murshid and the murid.
And specific practices.
The central rite is dik, which means remembrance of God, often through chanting divine names or contemplative practices. You also have things like the Mevlevi whirling dance, sema, which is a form of dik.
And key figures.
Huge figures like Rumi, of course, whose poetry is beloved worldwide. Also Ibn Arabi, a profound metaphysician, Al-Ghazali, who integrated Sufism more into mainstream Islam, and early figures like Rabia al-Adawiya, a female mystic focused on pure love for God. Rumi's Masnavi is even revered by some as the Quran in Persian.
Then we have Vedanta and yoga from the Hindu tradition. Vedanta is like the philosophical core based on the Upanishads, and Advaita Vedanta is particularly influential.
Hugely influential, yes. Systematized by the philosopher Shankara. Its core idea is absolutely radical. The identity of the individual self, the Atman, with ultimate reality, Brahman.
So my true self is the ultimate reality.
According to Advaita, yes. The perception that we are separate individuals living in a world of multiplicity is ultimately Maya, kind of cosmic illusion or superimposition.
And the goal is?
Moksha, liberation from samsara, the cycle of birth and death. And this comes through jnana, the direct realization, the experiential knowing that Atman is Brahman, realizing your inherent divinity.
And yoga provides the practical method for achieving this realization.
Yeah.
The term itself means union, right?
Exactly. Yoga provides the practical methodology. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, a foundational text, defines yoga quite simply as yogas chitta vritti nirodha, the cessation of the modifications or fluctuations of the mind.
So calming the mental chatter.
Precisely. It outlines a systematic, 8-limbed process, Ashtanga yoga, designed to purify consciousness, steady the mind, and lead ultimately to samadhi, a state of deep meditative absorption where that realization of unity can dawn. So Vedanta provides the understanding, yoga provides the practical means.
Okay. Next, Zen Buddhism. This originated in China as Chan Buddhism, a synthesis of Indian Mahayana Buddhism and Chinese Taoism, and then it spread to Japan, becoming Zen.
That's right. Its core practice is zazen, just sitting meditation. And it famously emphasizes a special transmission outside the scriptures, meaning it privileges direct, intuitive understanding over reliance on texts or doctrines. It's about waking up now. The goal is a direct, sudden realization of your own inherent Buddha nature, Bushlush. This awakening is called Satori, or Kenshu.
And key doctrines.
Well, it draws on Mahayana concepts like shunyata, emptiness, meaning things lack inherent independent existence, and anatta, no self. Key figures include Bodhidharma, who legendarily brought it to China, Huineng, the sixth patriarch in China, and Duzin, who founded the Shu school in Japan. They often use Khan's paradoxical riddles to push students beyond conceptual thought.
And finally, Taoism, an ancient Chinese philosophical and religious tradition often attributed to the figure Laozi around 500 BCE.
Right. The central concept here is the Tao, often translated as the way. It's the fundamental cosmic force, the natural order of the universe. It's ineffable beyond words.
And the ideal is to live in harmony with it.
Exactly. The goal is harmony with the Tao, which is achieved through practices like Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action or spontaneity, acting in accordance with nature rather than forcing things. It emphasizes balance, symbolized by the yin-yang, simplicity, humility.
And the aim.
Living in harmony, achieving a kind of spiritual immortality or longevity. Its foundational texts are the incredibly poetic Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi, and the philosophical stories of the Zhuangzi. So what's the big takeaway from this whirlwind tour across the globe?
It seems to be just how universal these quests are.
I think so. It's the profound realization that despite the vast differences in culture, language, symbols, these traditions are all grappling with the same handful of fundamental human questions. Questions about reality, the self, the divine, suffering, liberation.
And they're using these unique languages and symbols to explore what seem to be remarkably similar territories of inner experience.
Exactly. This shared human quest for meaning, for direct experience, for transformation. That's perhaps the most powerful insight that emerges when you look at them together.
And a major commonality that keeps coming up is this pursuit of gnosis, that direct, personal, transformative knowledge of divine or ultimate reality, something far beyond just book learning or dogma.
Absolutely central.
Yeah.
It's not just knowing about something. It's a deep experiential knowing that changes you.
In the West, we saw Gnosticism literally named for it. Salvation came through gaining that secret, liberating gnosis that helped you remember the divine spark within.
Hmm. And Hermeticism also posits achieving a kind of godhood through understanding the divine mind, the gnosis. In fact, as we mentioned, some scholars like Versluis define Western esotericism itself by this very claim to gnosis.
And you see parallels in the East, too, right? Like in Vedanta, jnana is that direct realization which shatters the illusion of separation.
Precisely. Or in Sufism, Marifa is described as that intimate, interior knowledge of God, often contrasted with intellectual knowledge. Dus al-Nun al-Misri spoke eloquently about this.
And Zen Buddhism's Satori or Kenshu, that's exactly an intuitive flash of insight that bypasses concepts entirely.
Right. And crucially, across the board, this knowledge isn't just informational. It's meant to transform your perception, your behavior. It leads to profound internal shifts towards peace, liberation, compassion, love.
Another really pervasive idea connecting many of these traditions is as above, so below. That microcosm-macrocosm analogy.
Yes, this fundamental idea of a structural correspondence between the human being, the microcosm, and the entire universe, the macrocosm.
The idea that by understanding yourself, you understand the universe, and vice versa.
It's expressed most famously, perhaps, in Western Hermeticism, from the Emerald Tablet. That which is below is like to that which is above. It was absolutely central to Renaissance alchemy, where purifying metals in the lab was seen as mirroring the process of purifying the human soul.
And it wasn't just Hermeticism or alchemy.
No, it was prevalent in medieval Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy too. A very widespread way of thinking about our place in the cosmos.
And on the Eastern side, how does it show up there?
Well, in Vedanta, the individual self, the Jivatman, is seen as reflecting the supreme self, the Paramatman, like a miniature version of the universal.
Like a drop of water reflecting the ocean.
Exactly. Taoism views the human body itself as a small universe, and the goal is to harmonize the inner energies, the inner landscape, with the flow of the Tao in the greater cosmos.
And Sufism.
Sufism has the rich concept of the perfect man, al-insan al-kamil. This is an archetypal human being who fully reflects all of God's names and attributes, acting as a bridge between the divine and creation, a synthesis of all existence, a perfect microcosm.
So these analogies, they really validate that inward turn, don't they?
They absolutely do. They suggest that the universe's deepest secrets are somehow encoded within us, making the journey of self-discovery simultaneously a cosmic quest.
Now, if we look at the sort of architecture of the divine, you pointed out some striking similarities in the models of divine emanation and hierarchy, particularly in Sufism and Kabbalah.
Yes, it's quite remarkable. Both traditions map the relationship between the utterly transcendent God and the manifest world through these complex hierarchical models of divine emanation.
And these aren't just abstract diagrams.
Not at all. They serve both as cosmological charts, explaining how the universe came to be, and as practical guides for the mystic's inner journey back towards the source.
So in Kabbalah, we have the Ein Sof emanating through the 10 Sephirah.
Right, these divine potencies or attributes arranged in the tree of life, which, as we said, is a map of the cosmos, a blueprint for creation, and a diagram of the human soul. The path involves a spiritual ascent, navigating these Sephiros.
And Sufism has something analogous.
Sufism, particularly in certain schools, talks about the Latafasita, the six subtleties. These are subtle centers or organs of perception within the human being, kind of like chakras, that are activated sequentially on the path to polish the mirror of the heart, allowing for deeper and deeper realization of divine realities.
Where does this similarity come from? Direct borrowing.
Probably not direct borrowing in most cases, but they both drew heavily from a shared heritage, particularly the influence of Neoplatonism.
Ah, Plotinus.
Exactly. Plotinus's model of emanation from the ultimate one, down through intelligence, nous in the world soul, psyche, provided a common philosophical grammar, a shared toolkit, for mystics in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic contexts to articulate their own insights about the relationship between God and the world.
Okay, let's pivot slightly and look at the nature of the self. You mentioned Vedanta and Gnosticism both agree the true self is divine, and our ordinary condition is ignorance or illusion. But they draw very different conclusions from that starting point.
Dramatically different conclusions, yes. Vedanta, especially Advaita Vedanta, makes this radical affirmation of the self's inherent divinity. Atman is Brahman.
Yeah.
Your individual self is identical with ultimate reality.
And the perception of being separate.
Is Maya, illusion. Liberation, moksha, isn't about achieving something new, but about realizing this inherent unity that was always already there. And importantly, the material world, in this view, is still a manifestation of Brahman, not something inherently evil or alien.
Whereas Gnosticism, as we just... Now, let's compare the path of transformation itself. Say, enlightenment in Buddhism versus spiritual alchemy. Both seem to start with the premise that our ordinary human state is one of impurity, ignorance, suffering.
A starting point of imperfection.
And both offer these rigorous processes of purification and refinement to achieve a higher state of being.
That's a great comparison. In Buddhism, the ultimate goal is nirvana, the cessation of suffering, dukkha, which is achieved by systematically purifying the mind of the three poisons, greed, hatred, and ignorance or delusion.
Through practices like the Noble Eightfold Path.
Exactly. The Buddha himself used the analogy of a goldsmith refining gold, removing the dross to reveal the inherent purity.
And spiritual alchemy uses that exact same metaphor of metallurgy, but applies it to the psyche.
Precisely. The alchemical great work, the magnum opus, begins with the prima materia, which psychologically represents the raw, chaotic, undifferentiated state of the psyche.
And the stages.
The sages, often described symbolically as nigredo, blackening dissolution, confronting the shadow, albedo, whitening purification, citrinitas, yellowing integration, sometimes omitted, and finally rubedo, reddening perfection, achieving the philosopher's stone, symbolizing the integrated whole self.
So both are these arduous, disciplined paths of transformation.
Very much so. The Buddhist works to remove the defilements obscuring the mind inherent luminosity. The alchemist works to transmute the base elements of the psyche into spiritual gold. Different symbols, but a similar underlying process of refinement and integration.
And one final thematic convergence that seems almost universal across these traditions, the crucial role of the guide, whether they're called gurus, masters, sheiks, adepts, initiators.
Yes, this seems absolutely essential in almost all these paths because the knowledge being transmitted isn't just theoretical, it's experiential, it's transformative. It often requires direct transmission, guidance from someone who has actually walked the path.
In the Eastern traditions, this is really explicit, isn't it? The guru-disciple relationship in Hinduism or Tibetan Buddhism.
It's absolutely central. The guru is seen not just as a teacher, but as a living embodiment of the teachings, a crucial link in the parampara or lineage of transmission. In Vajrayana Buddhism, the guru can even be viewed as a manifestation of the Buddha, and devotion, bhakti, towards the guru is considered vital for receiving blessings, atishdhana, and making progress.
We see similar dynamics in the West.
Definitely. In Sufism, that bond between the master, the sheikh, or murshid, and the disciple, the murid, is foundational. The sheikh inherits spiritual authority through a lineage, a silsila, going back to the Prophet Muhammad.
Like Rumi and Shams Tabrizi.
The classic example. Rumi's profound awakening was famously catalyzed by his encounter with his enigmatic master, Shams. And you see it in Hermetic literature, too, often structured as dialogues, where Hermes, the wise master, imparts wisdom to his disciples like Asclepius or Tat.
And Rosicrucianism.
Rosicrucianism speaks of hidden masters or adepts who are said to guide humanity's spiritual evolution. So the idea of guidance from those further along the path is deeply embedded.
So the core function is the same everywhere.
It seems to be. And the guide provides not just information, but initiation, context, correction, encouragement, that living transmission necessary to transform esoteric theory into profound mystical experience and lasting transformation.
Right. So, okay, we've traced these definitions, traditions, and themes. What does it all mean in the bigger picture? The influence of these ideas, as you said, isn't just confined to, dusty old books or secret orders.
Not at all.
They've profoundly shaped our world, often in ways we don't even realize. You really start to see how this unseen current has subtly yet powerfully shaped some of our most cherished cultural expressions.
And that raises a really important question, doesn't it? How have these often hidden, sometimes marginalized currents repeatedly surfaced to have such a profound impact on mainstream Western culture, fueling artistic innovation, literary expression, even movements for social and political reform? It's quite extraordinary.
One really powerful example is the esoteric imagination in art and literature. Think about the Renaissance. You had this revival of classical humanism, but it was combined with this intense interest in esoteric philosophy. the rediscovery of the corpus hermeticum. Christian thinkers getting deeply into Kabbalah.
Absolutely. Figures like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola were trying to synthesize everything, searching for a universal concord between these different wisdom traditions. And you see it directly in the art.
Like Albrecht Dürer.
Exactly.
Mm.
Works like his famous engraving Melancholia era are just dense with esoteric symbolism, references to astrology, numerology, the theory of humors, the Hermetic macrocosm principle. It shows how deeply these ideas permeated the creative spirit of the era.
And then fast forward to the late 19th century, you have the symbolist movement in art and literature reacting against materialism.
Yeah, a real pushback against scientific positivism.
And grounded in things like theosophy, Swedenborgianism, Rosicrucianism, this seems to have been a critical catalyst for abstract art, didn't it?
It absolutely was. Pioneers like Wassily Kandinsky explicitly articulated a theosophical vision in his influential book concerning the spiritual in art. He believed colors and forms had inherent spiritual vibrations and could be used to express inner truths and aid spiritual evolution.
And Hillman of Klint.
Yes, the recent rediscovery of her work is incredible. She was creating stunningly abstract paintings years before Kandinsky, Malevich, Mondrian, and explicitly stated she was guided by spirits, visually representing the interconnectedness of spiritual and material realms, complex spiritual diagrams. Modern art's birth really cannot be fully understood without acknowledging this esoteric foundation.
Mystical quests also run incredibly deep in modernist literature. W.B. Yeats, for one.
Oh, completely. His entire poetic vision was built on a lifelong immersion in theosophy, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, spiritualism. His complex symbolic system, outlined in A Vision and poems like The Second Coming, are articulated directly through this esoteric lens. It gave him a framework to understand history and the soul.
And T.S. Eliot. Different flavor, maybe more Christian.
Yes, deeply engaged with Christian mysticism, but still exploring similar territory. His four quartets, arguably his masterpiece, explicitly draws on figures like Julian of Norwich and St. John of the Cross. It's a profound exploration of spiritual apprehension, timeless moments, finding meaning beyond the intellect, grappling with spiritual dislocation in the modern world using these mystical frameworks.
And we can't forget the impact of Zen Buddhism, especially on the Beat generation after World War II.
Right. In post-war America, Zen seemed to offer an antidote to conformity, consumerism, materialism.
Writers like Jack Kerouac.
Kerouac and the Dharma Bums, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, they really popularized Zen concepts for a wider American audience.
What drew them to it?
They were drawn to its emphasis on direct experience, spontaneity, the rejection of rigid intellectualism. They saw parallels between Zen practice and things like jazz improvisation. By weaving Buddhist themes and attitudes into their poetry and prose, the Beats transmitted these Eastern ideas into the American mainstream, really paving the way for the counterculture of the 60s and a broader spiritual openness.
Beyond the arts, though, these currents sometimes fueled actual social transformation. You mentioned the 19th century spiritualist movement.
Yeah, it seems unlikely on the surface, right? Believing you could communicate with the dead through mediums.
But it played a crucial role in women's rights and the abolitionist movement. How?
Well, think about it. At a time when women were largely barred from public speaking, especially in religious contexts, spiritualism offered this unique loophole. Women acting as trance mediums could gain public platforms, speak with authority, supposedly channeling spirits independent of traditional patriarchal church structures.
Ah, okay. A way around the restriction.
Exactly. And these spiritualist circles became hotbeds of radical politics, advocating for equality, suffrage, abolition. Figures like Victoria Woodhull, who ran for president in 1872, the first woman to do so, came directly out of the spiritualist movement.
Wow. Then there's Theosophy, founded by Helena Blavatsky in 1875. You said this was the direct progenitor of the modern New Age movement.
Very much so. Blavatsky created this monumental synthesis. She drew from Eastern religions, popularizing concepts like karma, reincarnation, chakras in the West, combined them with Western esotericism, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, and even tried to reconcile it all with emerging science.
And this mix provided the framework.
It provided the core ideological framework and much of the vocabulary for what would become the New Age movement decades later. Key theosophical ideas like evolutionary spirituality, humanity evolving towards godhood, the idea of coming New Age, the age of Aquarius, the belief in ascended masters guiding humanity, and a focus on self-spirituality all became absolutely central to the New Age worldview. It really resonated with people feeling disillusioned with both traditional religion and materialistic science.
And just briefly, what about the historical relationship between Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism? We hear them mentioned together sometimes.
Yeah, there's definitely an intersection and mutual influence. They both emerged from that same intellectual ferment of the early modern period, that same milieu fascinated by Hermetic philosophy, ancient wisdom, secret knowledge, and moral improvement.
So not a direct lineage, but shared interests.
Exactly. While there isn't a direct organizational lineage, Rosicrucian themes, symbols, and ideas were definitely incorporated into some of the higher degrees of Freemasonry, like the Scottish Rite's Knight of the Rosecroix degree. And formal bodies were even created, like the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, SRIA, specifically for Master Masons who wanted to study Rosicrucianism and related esoteric subjects. It shows a recognized overlap in interests.
It's clear that certain influential figures were absolutely crucial in synthesizing this knowledge and transmitting it through history, like Plotinus, back in the 3rd century CE, founder of Neoplatonism.
Absolutely pivotal. His writings, collected as the Enneads, developed this incredibly influential cosmology where all reality emanates outwards from an ineffable, ultimate source, the One, through successive levels like intelligence, nous, and soul, psyche.
And he described the path back.
Yes, he articulated a clear path for the individual soul's return to that source, culminating in ecstatic union, kenosis. His framework profoundly shaped Christian, Islamic, and Jewish mysticism for centuries. He basically provided the philosophical language many later mystics use to understand and describe their experiences.
Then there's Meister Eckhart, the German Dominican mystic from the 13th, 14th centuries.
Another giant. Deeply influenced by Neoplatonism, Eckhart taught about the Seelengrund, the ground of the soul, this uncreated spark or apex within the soul that is eternally united with the Godhead.
And he advocated for.
He advocated for radical detachment, Abgeschiedenheit, from all worldly concerns, even from spiritual consolations, to make space for the birth of the Word in the soul. His teachings on divine immanence were controversial in his time. He was tried for heresy, but incredibly influential later on.
And of course, Helena Blavatsky, who we just discussed in the 19th century.
Arguably the single most important figure in the formation of modern Western esotericism. Co-founding the Theosophical Society was huge, but it was her books, Isis Unveiled, and especially The Secret Doctrine, that attempted this monumental synthesis of world religions, esoteric traditions, and science into what she called the ancient wisdom.
And she really popularized Eastern concepts.
Massively. She introduced or popularized concepts like karma and reincarnation to a wide Western audience and laid the foundational ideology for countless subsequent esoteric and New Age movements. A hugely influential, if also controversial figure.
And finally, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist in the 20th century, he seems like a bridge figure.
A profound bridge between psychology and esotericism, yes. Jung proposed the idea of the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche shared by all humans, containing universal patterns or archetypes.
And he saw value in these esoteric traditions.
He saw immense psychological sophistication in them. He studied Gnosticism, alchemy, Kabbalah, not as literal descriptions of the world, but as complex symbolic systems mapping the psyche and its transformation. For Jung, the alchemical quest, for instance, was a powerful allegory for what he called individuation, the lifelong psychological process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche to achieve wholeness.
So he kind of psychologized esotericism.
In a way, yes. He offered a modern psychological language for understanding the deep truths embedded in these ancient spiritual and esoteric paths. He engaged deeply with concepts like the Sufi mundus imaginalis, imaginal world. His work profoundly influenced modern spirituality and therapy, demonstrating how these ancient paths continue to speak to the modern condition.
It really shows this cyclical flow, doesn't it? Ideas get secularized, absorbed into culture, art, politics, psychology, then maybe re-spiritualized into new systems. They're incredibly resilient and adaptable.
That's a key point. Their resilience is remarkable.
Okay, this all sounds incredibly powerful, inspiring even, but, we also need to look at the other side of the coin. No deep dive is complete without a critical appraisal. How do these claims actually hold up to modern scrutiny?
That's a really important question and absolutely necessary. While these traditions offer profound insights and meaning for many, their claims have faced significant challenges. From scholarly perspectives, scientific viewpoints, theological critiques, these provide crucial context and alternative explanations we need to consider.
Right. So within academia, in the study of mysticism itself, there's this big debate you mentioned earlier, perennialism versus constructionism.
Exactly. The perennialist position, famously argued by people like Aldous Huxley in the perennial philosophy, suggests there's a universal, common core experience underlying all mystical traditions across cultures.
Like a shared, ineffable, non-dual union.
Right. The interpretations might differ based on cultural language and beliefs, but the underlying experience is supposedly the same.
But the constructionist view challenges that.
Yes, and it's arguably the dominant view in religious studies today. Constructionists, or contextualists, argue that there's no such thing as a pure, unmediated experience. All experience, including mystical experience, is inevitably shaped or constructed by the individual's language, beliefs, cultural context, expectations, practices.
So a Christian mystic having a vision of Christ and a Buddhist meditator experiencing emptiness.
Are having fundamentally different experiences, shaped by their different conceptual frameworks and goals, not just different interpretations of the same underlying event.
And critics of perennialism argue it can be a bit reductive.
Yeah, they argue it sometimes selectively focuses on similarities while ignoring crucial differences, potentially imposing a kind of false unity, and maybe even subtly creating a hierarchy where one type of experience is seen as more authentic than others.
And similarly, that academic category of Western esotericism itself faces critiques, doesn't it?
It does. Some scholars argue it's primarily a modern scholarly construct, not necessarily reflecting a unified historical tradition that people at the time would have recognized.
The concern being.
The concern is that it risks becoming that artificial wastebasket category. Hanegraaff warned about lumping together vastly diverse, rejected knowledge and imposing a false sense of unity or coherence where perhaps none existed historically. It risks obscuring the specificities of individual movements.
Okay, moving beyond academic debates, what about scientific and psychological scrutiny? These offer more sort of naturalistic explanations for some of these phenomena, like the neuroscience of mystical states.
Right. Modern neuroimaging techniques have shown that practices like meditation do induce measurable changes in the brain.
What kind of changes?
Things like increased gray matter density in areas linked to attention, self-awareness, and emotion regulation, like the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, maybe reduced activity in the amygdala related to fear, and alterations in brainwave patterns.
Which provides a biological correlation.
Exactly. It provides biological correlations for the reported benefits like stress reduction and emotional balance. However, more reductionist critics might argue that this shows mystical experiences are nothing but specific patterns of neural activity, the age-old correlation versus causation issue.
And what about the use of entheogens, psychoactive substances? We know many traditions historically used them: soma in ancient India, the kaikin brew in the Eleusinian mysteries, peyote, ayahuasca in indigenous cultures.
In modern research, for example, the well-known studies at Johns Hopkins using psilocybin from magic mushrooms under controlled conditions.
What did they find?
They found that these substances can reliably induce experiences that participants describe as profoundly spiritually significant, often ranking them among the most meaningful experiences of their lives. And critically, these experiences are often phenomenologically indistinguishable from classic mystical experiences reported by non-drug mystics throughout history.
Which definitely raises profound questions.
Oh, absolutely. About the chemical basis of spirituality, the nature of consciousness, the relationship between brain states and subjective experience. It complicates any simple dismissal of these states.
Psychology also offers explanations for things like out-of-body experiences, OBEs, which are sometimes cited in esoteric contexts.
Yes. From a mainstream psychological viewpoint, OBEs are generally considered dissociative experiences. They might stem from various neurological or psychological factors, things like sleep paralysis, the hypnagogic state between waking and sleeping, high stress, trauma, possibly even a kind of coping mechanism.
And neuroscience backs this up.
There's research showing that OBE-like sensations, feeling like you're floating outside your body, can actually be induced by stimulating specific brain regions, particularly the right angular gyrus in the temporoparietal junction.
Suggesting it's about brain function.
It suggests these experiences might arise from a temporary disruption in the brain's complex process of constructing our sense of self and body image, rather than, say, a literal soul or consciousness leaving the physical body.
Okay, finally, these traditions have also faced significant theological and sociological critiques, especially from more mainstream perspectives.
Yes, particularly from orthodox monotheistic religions. Gnosticism, for example, was rigorously refuted and condemned as heresy by the early Christian church fathers.
Why? What were the main issues?
Several key things. It's radical dualism, the idea of a lesser, flawed, even evil creator god, the demiurge, was seen as blasphemous. It's docetism, the belief that Christ only seemed to be human and didn't truly suffer physically undermined core Christian doctrine. And it's spiritual elitism, the idea that salvation came only through secret gnosis available to a select few, contrasted sharply with the Christian emphasis on salvation through faith accessible to all.
And more generally, the kind of pantheistic or pantheistic worldviews found in many mystical traditions where God and the world are seen as deeply interconnected or even identical.
Right. Those views are often criticized by Orthodox theology for blurring the fundamental distinction between the creator and creation. This is seen as a threat to God's absolute transcendence and sovereignty, and potentially leading down paths seen as problematic, like nature worship or self-deification.
So a general rejection of esotericism often stems from.
Often stems from its perceived syncretism, mixing different religious ideas, its reliance on extra-scriptural or private revelation, and its emphasis on secret knowledge that bypasses established religious authority and tradition.
And sociologically, what about critiques of more modern phenomena like the New Age movement, which draws heavily on these traditions?
Sociologists often analyze New Age movements as a social product of modern conditions like detraditionalization, the decline of traditional religious authority, and increased individualism in Western societies.
And the concerns are.
Concerns are sometimes raised about what's called spiritual consumerism, or the spiritual supermarket phenomenon. The idea is that spiritual ideas and practices get detached from their original, often demanding contexts. They might be watered down, commodified, mixed and matched in eclectic ways, leading potentially to a kind of eclectic, sometimes superficial self-spirituality that might lack the rigorous discipline, ethical framework, or supportive community found in more traditional religious paths. It's also sometimes critiqued as being rather class-based, appealing primarily to affluent segments of society and maybe lacking a coherent structure for addressing broader social issues.
Wow. What a journey we've been on, from definitions to global traditions, thematic links, cultural impact, and now these critical appraisals.
It's a vast landscape.
You've really seen how these traditions, far from being just marginal curiosities, represent this persistent, incredibly influential, unseen current throughout our history. And they clearly continue to shape how we seek meaning in the world today.
Absolutely. We've explored how these incredibly diverse traditions, from ancient Gnosticism questioning the very nature of reality to modern abstract artists trying to paint the spiritual, are often united by these recurring, powerful themes.
Like that constant pursuit of direct transformative gnosis.
And that profound microcosm-macrocosm analogy, as above, so below. They consistently offer these intricate maps for the soul's journey, whether it is the Kabbalistic tree of life, the stage of the alchemical great work, the Sufi path of the heart.
All pointing in their different ways towards a goal of union or liberation or profound harmony with some kind of higher reality.
Exactly.
And it seems that despite all the critiques from theology, from sociology, even from neuroscience, offering alternative explanations, the allure of mystical and esoteric knowledge clearly persists.
It absolutely does. They seem to speak to a fundamental human yearning, don't they? A yearning for personal meaning beyond the mundane, for direct, first-hand experience rather than just belief, and maybe for a sense of enchantment or deeper connection in what can feel like a rationalized, often disconnected modern world.
The unseen current flows on.
It really does. Continually challenging our settled assumptions about consciousness, about reality, and maybe about the ultimate limits or potential of being human.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. What hidden knowledge, what unseen currents might you still be overlooking in your own quest for understanding?